"Your rank is a joke," my father said, not even looking up from his plate. He was cutting his steak, slow and precise, the way he did everything. The knife scraped porcelain. My mother flinched at the sound, but said nothing. My brother Kyle sat across from me, smirking into his wineglass, and my father just kept cutting that steak like he hadn't said anything at all, like it was weather, like it was fact. I was wearing my dress blues. I'd driven 4 hours from Joint Base Lewis McChord to Boise for this dinner, because my mother had called 3 times asking me to come, because she said it would mean so much, because she said your father's been asking about you. Which I knew even then was a lie, but I came anyway. I came because I'd just been promoted to captain in the United States Army, Criminal Investigation Division, and some foolish, stubborn part of me thought maybe this time he'd see it. He didn't see it. He saw Kyle. He always saw Kyle. Kyle, who was 34 and already a senior account manager at Wexler Brandt Financial Group in downtown Boise. Kyle, who wore a watch that cost more than my car. Kyle, who my father described to his golf friends as my son the executive, while describing me, when he described me at all, as she's doing something with the military. Kyle, who at that very moment was laundering money for 3 separate clients through a web of shell companies so intricate it had taken my colleagues at CID 6 months just to map the first layer. But I didn't know that yet. Not all of it. That dinner was 11 months before the warrants. 11 months before Kyle's face went white in a conference room while 2 federal agents read him his rights. 11 months before my father called me for the first time in 9 years without my mother dialing the number for him. My name is Nora Calloway. I'm 31 years old, and this is the story of how my family spent 20 years betting on the wrong child. I need to go back. Not to the beginning, exactly, but to the part that explains why I sat at that table in my dress blues and didn't say a word when my father called my rank a joke. Why I just set my fork down and folded my hands and let the silence do what silence does, which is make cruel people uncomfortable if you hold it long enough. I grew up in Eagle, Idaho, just outside Boise, in a house that sat on 2 acres with a creek running through the back. Beautiful property. My father, Gerald Calloway, had built his career in commercial real estate development. He'd turned 5 strip malls and a bankrupt hotel into a small empire by the time I was born, and he never let anyone forget it. He was the kind of man who measured people by what they produced, what they earned, what they controlled. Love was a ledger to him. You deposited achievements, and he might, occasionally, withdraw a moment of warmth. Kyle was his greatest investment. First son, broad shoulders, easy grin, the kid who shook hands like an adult at 12 and charmed every teacher into forgetting missed assignments. My father started grooming him early. Business dinners at 15, a corner office internship at Wexler Brandt the summer after high school, an MBA from Boise State, funded without question. Then there was me. I was quieter, smaller. I read too much, my father said. I asked too many questions, he said. When I was 9, I found a discrepancy in the change my mother got back from the grocery store, and I sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes re-adding the receipt until I found the error. 63 cents. My grandfather, my mother's father, watched me do this from the doorway. He didn't interrupt. When I finally looked up, triumphant, holding the receipt like evidence, he sat down across from me and said something I have carried in my chest ever since. Nora, the world is full of people who don't want to be counted carefully. You keep counting anyway. Grandpa Orrin was a retired postal inspector. Most people don't even know what that is. He spent 31 years investigating mail fraud, embezzlement, identity theft. Quiet work, meticulous work. He had a small office in the basement of his house in Meridian, filled with filing cabinets, And when I was a kid, he'd let me sit in there and look through old case files he'd redacted himself with a black marker, teaching me what to notice, how to find what people tried to hide. He smelled like pipe tobacco and black coffee, and his hands were steady even when he was 80. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. My father thought he was a bore, said it openly. "Orrin, you spent your whole career chasing nickel and dime crooks through the mail. That's not a career, that's a hobby." He said this at Thanksgiving dinner in 2009 while Grandpa Orrin was passing the cranberry sauce. My grandfather just set the dish down and said, "Gerald, the biggest frauds I ever caught started with nickels and dimes." Then he winked at me. Just at me. I enlisted in the Army the week after I graduated from Bora High School. My father didn't come to the ceremony. He was at Kyle's MBA graduation party instead, the one he threw at the Arid Club downtown with 60 guests and a jazz quartet. My mother came to my swearing-in alone, crying quietly in the third row, and afterward she hugged me in the parking lot and whispered, "He wanted to be here." I loved her too much to say what we both knew. Basic training at Fort Jackson, then Fort Huachuca for military police school. Then something clicked in me that Grandpa Orrin had probably seen years before. I applied to the Criminal Investigation Command, and I got in. I was 23. I was the youngest woman in my cohort, and one of only 4 women total, and I was good at it. Not good the way Kyle was good at things, which was mostly charm and confidence and knowing whose hand to shake. I was good the way my grandfather was good. I noticed what didn't fit. I followed the 63 cents until it became 63,000, until it became 600,000, until someone's entire life unraveled on a spreadsheet in front of me, and all I had to do was show my work. I had a bad knee from a training injury at Fort Jackson, the kind that ached before rain and made me limp slightly when I was tired. I'd torn my ACL during a night land navigation exercise, stepping into a hole I couldn't see in the dark. I rehabbed it myself for 3 weeks before telling anyone, because I was afraid they'd wash me out. They didn't. But I carried it. I still carry it. Some nights, after a long day of interviews and evidence review, I'd sit in my car in the parking lot at Lewis McCord and just press my palm against my knee and breathe until the pain became manageable. And then I'd drive home to my apartment in Lakewood and eat dinner alone and go to bed and get up and do it again. Nobody in my family asked about my cases. Nobody asked about my soldiers. Nobody asked about the commendation I received for helping dismantle a procurement fraud ring at Fort Hood that had siphoned $2.1 million through falsified contracts. I brought the commendation letter home for Christmas in 2021 and left it on the kitchen counter, not to show off, but because it had fallen out of my bag. Kyle picked it up, glanced at it, and said, "Cute." Then he went back to telling my father about his latest client, a real estate developer from Coeur d'Alene who was going to make them all very rich. That client's name was Martin Voller, and that was the name I would see again, 14 months later, on a federal indictment. But I need to go back before I go forward, because you need to understand the woman who stood in that kitchen and said nothing when her brother said cute. And you need to understand why she said nothing, and why she had been saying nothing for a very long time. My name is Claire Aldridge, and I grew up in Lakewood, Colorado, in a split-level house on Garrison Street, with a yard that backed up to a drainage ditch, and a father who believed that competence was something you proved loudly or not at all. My mother died when I was 11, ovarian cancer, diagnosed in April and gone by September. And after that, my father raised us the only way he knew how, which was like a man coaching a team he did not particularly like but felt obligated to win with. Kyle was the quarterback. I was the equipment manager. I was a quiet kid, small for my age, serious, the kind of girl who read the newspaper at breakfast and got called weird for it. I wore my hair in a single braid down my back until I was 16 because I did not want to spend time on it, and I had a habit of watching people for a long time before I spoke to them, which my father interpreted as shyness, but was actually something closer to reconnaissance. I was cataloging. I was filing. Even then, I was building cases in my head. I just did not know the word for it yet. I joined the Army at 18 because a recruiter came to Lakewood High and said something that no one in my family had ever said to me. He said, "You look like someone who finishes things." That was it. That was the entire pitch. I signed the papers 2 weeks later. My father drove me to the recruiting station, and on the way there he said, "Well, at least they will teach you some structure." As though I was someone who lacked it. As though the girl who had maintained a 3.8 GPA while doing all the household laundry since age 12 needed external discipline. I went to Fort Leonard Wood for basic, then Fort Huachuca for military intelligence training, which is where I learned that my particular brain, the quiet one, the watching one, the one that filed everything and forgot nothing, was not a deficiency. It was a weapon. I graduated second in my class and received a commendation from the battalion commander, who wrote that Specialist Aldridge demonstrates an unusual capacity for analytical patience. I kept that letter in a box under my bunk for years. Analytical patience. It was the first time anyone had taken the thing my family considered a flaw and called it a strength. I transferred into the Army Criminal Investigation Division in 2014, after 4 years of intelligence work. CID was where I found myself. The work was meticulous, unglamorous, and slow. You sat in rooms with paper. You followed money through accounts that had been layered and relayered to look clean. You interviewed people who lied to you for hours, and you sat there and let them lie, because every lie was a brick, and you were building a wall around them, and they did not know it. I was good at this. I was very good at this. My first major case was a supply sergeant at Fort Carson, who had been selling vehicle parts to a civilian dealer in Colorado Springs for 3 years. Everyone knew something was off, but no one could prove it because the paperwork was immaculate. I spent 5 months on that case. I cross-referenced serial numbers on parts manifests with delivery receipts from the dealer and found 11 discrepancies that traced back to a single forged signature. The sergeant went to Leavenworth for 22 months. My supervisor, a chief warrant officer named Linda Okafor, took me aside afterward and said the thing I carry to this day. She was a tall woman, severe, with reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. And she had this way of speaking where every word sounded like it had been weighed on a scale before she released it. She said, "Claire, people like us do not get to be loud. We do not get to slam the table. What we get to do is be right and be ready and be so thoroughly prepared that when the moment comes, the room has no choice but to be silent and listen." I carried that sentence through 12 years and 9 investigations. I carried it through 2 deployments, one to Kuwait and one to a base in Germany, where I helped unravel a kickback scheme involving local contractors and a lieutenant colonel who thought his rank made him untouchable. It did not. I carried Linda's words through my promotion to warrant officer, through my transfer to the fraud division, through the nights when I sat alone in my apartment in Killeen, Texas, eating takeout from a styrofoam container, and reading bank statements until my eyes burned. And I carried it home, every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, to that split level on Garrison Street where my father would ask Kyle about his cases and his clients and his billable hours, and then turn to me at the end of dinner and say, "So, Claire, anything new with you?" in the same voice you would use to ask a neighbor about their lawn. I had a bad left knee from a fall during a training exercise in 2016. It ached in cold weather, and I had a slight hitch in my walk that I tried to hide because I did not want to give anyone a reason to question my fitness. I mention this because it mattered later, in the courtroom, when I had to stand for a long time and my knee was screaming, but I did not shift my weight and I did not sit down because Linda Okafor taught me that the room watches your body before it listens to your words. The first time I understood the pattern for what it was, I was 29 years old, standing in my parents' kitchen in a dress uniform because I had just been promoted to special agent. I had driven 3 hours from the field office in Richmond to tell them in person because I thought, stupidly, that seeing the badge might make it real for them in a way that words over the phone never could. My mother hugged me and said, "Congratulations, honey," and then immediately asked if I wanted leftover pot roast. My father was in the living room, watching a Redskins game. He muted the television when I walked in, looked at me, looked at the badge, and said, "Well, that is nice, Claire, but, Kyle just made junior partner, and he is only 31. Then he unmuted the television. I stood there in my dress uniform in the living room of the house I grew up in, and I felt the silence fill me like cold water. Not anger, something flatter than anger. The recognition that I had just achieved something fewer than 2% of applicants achieve, and my father had weighed it in his hand and found it lighter than a title at a mid-size law firm in Fairfax. That was the first episode. The second was Thanksgiving of 2018. Kyle had brought Diana, his girlfriend at the time, a very thin woman with very white teeth who worked in pharmaceutical sales. My father seated Kyle at his right hand, which was where he always seated Kyle, and spent the first 40 minutes of dinner asking about a product liability case Kyle was working. I listened. I had just come off a 6-month undercover assignment investigating a mortgage fraud ring that had stolen $11 million from elderly homeowners in the Tidewater region. I had spent months pretending to be someone I was not, living in a rented apartment in Norfolk with a prepaid phone and a cover identity, and I had helped build a case that would eventually result in 14 federal indictments. I was tired in a way that went past my bones and into some deeper architecture. When there was a pause in the Kyle show, my mother asked me how work was going. I started to say something about the case, keeping it vague because I could not share details, and my father interrupted me. He said, "Claire, Kyle's work actually affects people's lives." Then he laughed, not cruelly exactly, but in that way he had of laughing that told you he considered the matter settled and light. Diana laughed too. Kyle did not laugh. I will give him that. He looked at his plate. But he did not say anything either. And silence in the presence of dismissal is its own kind of agreement. I excused myself to help my mother with the pumpkin pie. In the kitchen, she touched my arm and said, "Your father does not mean it the way it sounds." I said, "I know, Mom. I said it the way you say things you have said so many times they have lost their shape." The third episode was Kyle's engagement party in the spring of 2019. My parents hosted it at the house, 40 people in the backyard, a caterer, white lights strung between the maple trees. I had offered to help pay for it. My father had said, No, Kyle is handling the finances," which was not true. I found out later from my mother that my father had taken $12,000 from their savings to pay for the party. But the point was not the money. The point was what happened during the toast. My father stood up with a glass of Prosecco and gave a speech about Kyle. He talked about Kyle's academic achievements, Kyle's career, Kyle's character. He called Kyle the son he always wanted. He was looking right at Kyle when he said it, and I was standing 6 feet away holding a glass of the same Prosecco, and I felt the words go through me like a needle through cloth. Clean, precise, not even painful in the moment. Just a puncture. The son he always wanted. Not the child, the son. As if the daughter, standing 6 feet away with a federal badge and a bad knee and a commendation letter from the director of the FBI, was a rough draft of something he had been trying to write his whole life, and Kyle was the final version. I did not say anything. I smiled. I raised my glass. People clinked. Later that night, I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could drive. I did not cry. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and breathed. I counted the breaths the way Linda Okafor taught me to count when things were loud inside and you needed them quiet. In through the nose for 4, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 6. I did this 17 times. Then I drove back to Richmond in the dark with the radio off. The 4th episode was the worst because it was the most public, and because by then I should have known better than to keep showing up with my heart in my hands. Christmas 2020. COVID had thinned the gathering, but there were still a dozen people at the house, mostly family. Kyle and Diana were there, newly married. My father was in an expansive mood, pouring bourbon, telling stories. At one point, Kyle mentioned that he was thinking about buying a vacation property in the Outer Banks. My father lit up. He started talking about investment strategies, tax advantages, how smart Kyle was with money. Then he turned to me, bourbon in hand, and said, "Claire, maybe Kyle could teach you a thing or two about building wealth instead of chasing criminals around for a government salary." Several people laughed. An uncle, a cousin. Diana covered her smile with her hand. I was holding a glass of water. I set it down carefully on the counter. I said, "Actually, Dad, I am doing fine financially." He waved his hand. He said, "Fine is not the same as thriving, Claire. Kyle is thriving." Kyle was sitting on the couch. He had his arm around Diana. He looked comfortable. He looked like a man who had never once had to wonder whether his father saw him. I looked at him, and I thought about the fact that I had spent the previous March working 16-hour days to help dismantle a human trafficking network that operated out of massage parlors along the I-95 corridor, and that we had rescued 11 women, and that I had sat with one of them in an interview room while she told me things that I will never repeat, and that I still sometimes hear when I am trying to fall asleep. I could have said that. I could have made a scene. I could have listed my cases, my commendations, my clearance level, the things I had done that Kyle in his glass office in Fairfax could not imagine. But I looked at my father, and I understood something very clearly. He was never going to see it. Not because the evidence was insufficient, because he had decided what the verdict was before the trial began. I was his daughter, and I was in law enforcement, and in his mind, those two facts together did not add up to anything that competed with a son-in-law who wore good suits and talked about equity. So I said nothing. I picked up my water. I took a sip. My knee was aching from standing too long, and I shifted my weight just slightly, and no one noticed because no one was looking at me. That was the whole point. No one was looking at me. No one was looking at me. And for 37 years, that had been enough to make me shrink, to make me quieter, smaller, more agreeable, to make me nod when I should have spoken and leave rooms when I should have stayed. But that night, something changed. It was not dramatic. There was no slamming of doors, no tearful confrontation in the driveway, no moment where I turned and delivered the perfect line that silenced everyone. Real life does not work that way. What happened was much smaller and much more permanent. I drove home. The Belt Parkway was empty at that hour, just the orange highway lights sliding over my windshield one after another like a slow pulse. My knee throbbed. I had the radio off. I could still smell my mother's roast on my coat, that heavy rosemary and garlic smell that used to mean safety when I was a child, and now just meant endurance. I pulled into my apartment complex in Kensington, parked in my assigned spot next to the dumpster because I had the worst spot in the lot, and I sat there with the engine running. I was not crying. I want to be clear about that. I was not angry either, not in the way you might expect. What I felt was something closer to clarity. Like I had been looking at one of those optical illusions for years, the one where you see either a vase or two faces, and I had finally seen the other image, and I knew I could never unsee it. My father was never going to change his mind about me. Not because he was evil, not because he hated me, but because changing his mind would mean admitting that he had been wrong for decades. And my father was a man who had built his entire identity on never being wrong. He had picked Kyle. He had picked him early, picked him loudly, picked him in front of everyone. And admitting that his daughter, the one he had spent years dismissing, was the one who had actually built something real, would mean admitting that his judgment was flawed. That was a cost he would never pay. Not for me, not for anyone. I turned off the engine. The silence was immediate and total. I could hear the ticking of the car cooling down, the distant hum of the BQE, a dog barking somewhere in the complex. I sat in that silence for a long time. And then I thought about Grandpa Teddy. He had been gone 4 months by then. Lung cancer, fast and merciless, the way he would have wanted it if he had to go at all. 81 years old, a retired postal inspector who had spent 30 years catching people who thought they were smarter than the system. He was the one who had driven me to my interview at the FBI field office in Manhattan. He was the one who had ironed my shirt that morning because my hands were shaking too badly to do it myself. And when I came out 3 hours later, drained and uncertain, he was leaning against his old Buick in the parking garage with 2 coffees, and he looked at me and said something I did not fully understand until that night in my car. He said, "The quiet ones close the case, Nora. The loud ones just close the door." I had laughed at the time. It sounded like one of his postal inspector sayings, the kind of thing he would embroider on a pillow if he were that type of man, which he was not. But sitting in my car in that parking lot, with the smell of rosemary still on my coat, and my knee still aching, and my father's voice still echoing in my head, I understood what he meant. He was not telling me to be patient. He was not telling me to wait for recognition. He was telling me that the work was the thing. The quiet, meticulous, unglamorous work. The cases built line by line, document by document, interview by interview. That was where the truth lived. Not in boardrooms, not at Thanksgiving tables, not in the opinions of men who had already made up their minds. And here is the part that mattered. Here is the part that changed everything. Sitting in that car, I did not make a decision to prove my father wrong. I did not make a decision to take Kyle down. I did not make a decision driven by anger or revenge or any of the things that make for good television. I made a decision to stop pretending I did not see what I saw. Because I had seen things. Over the past 2 years, small things, things that did not add up. Kyle's fund had posted returns that were remarkably consistent, quarter after quarter, in markets that were anything but consistent. He had mentioned clients at those dinners, names I recognized, names that had come across my desk in other contexts. There was a pattern in the way he talked about compliance, always dismissive, always amused, as if the rules were quaint suggestions designed for lesser people. And there was one dinner, maybe 8 months earlier, where he had taken a phone call in my mother's kitchen, and I had heard him say something to someone, just a fragment, just 4 words, but they had stayed with me the way a wrong note stays with you long after the song is over. He had said, "They will never check." I had filed it away at the time. I had told myself it was probably nothing. I had told myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my personal feelings about Kyle color my professional judgment, that seeing fraud everywhere was an occupational hazard. I had done what I always did. I had talked myself out of trusting my own instincts. But that night in the car, I stopped doing that. I stopped making excuses for the things I had noticed. I stopped telling myself that I was being unfair. I stopped prioritizing my father's comfort over my own knowledge. I went upstairs. I unlocked my apartment. I hung my coat on the hook by the door. I filled a glass of water from the tap and drank it, standing at the kitchen counter. Then I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and I began to write down every single thing I had noticed about Kyle Barrington's business over the past 2 years. Every odd comment, every inconsistent number, every name he had dropped that connected to something else. I wrote for 2 hours. When I was done, I had 11 pages. I did not know yet what I was going to do with them. I did not have a plan. What I had was something more dangerous than a plan. I had the truth, organized and waiting, and I had finally stopped apologizing for knowing it. I closed the laptop. I went to bed. I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, I woke at 5:15, the way I always do, force of habit from years of early briefings at the field office. But instead of reaching for my phone to check emails, I lay still for a moment and stared at the ceiling. The plaster had a hairline crack running from the light fixture to the corner. I had noticed it the day I moved in 3 years ago and never fixed it. I thought about that, about how many things I had noticed and never fixed. I got up. I made coffee in the French press my grandfather had given me, the one with the chipped handle he refused to let me replace. I drank it black at the kitchen counter while the sky over Arlington turned from iron to pale copper. Then I opened the laptop again and reread every word of those 11 pages. They were messy, stream of consciousness, but the bones were there. I spent that Saturday morning turning them into something structured. I created a timeline. I cross-referenced dates Kyle had mentioned specific deals with dates I had quietly noted unusual wire transfer patterns at work. Patterns that had come across my desk during routine compliance reviews at the Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit. I was not investigating Kyle. That is important to understand. I had never been investigating Kyle. But when you spend 8 years analyzing financial fraud for a living, your brain does not shut off at Thanksgiving dinner. You hear your brother mention a shell company in Wilmington, Delaware, and a name lights up in your memory because you saw that same name in a suspicious activity report 6 months earlier. You do not go looking for trouble. Trouble walks into your kitchen, carrying a bottle of expensive wine and kissing your mother on the cheek. By noon, I had a clean document, 14 pages now, with footnotes. I saved it to an encrypted drive and locked the drive in the small, fireproof safe I kept in my bedroom closet, the one my father had mocked when he saw it during the single time he visited my apartment. "What do you keep in there, state secrets?" he had said, and Kyle had laughed, and I had said nothing. On Monday, I went to work. I said nothing to anyone. I did my job. I reviewed case files for a mortgage fraud investigation in Prince William County. I attended a meeting about new FinCEN reporting guidelines. I ate lunch alone at my desk, a turkey sandwich from the deli on Courthouse Road. I did this for 2 weeks. I did not contact a lawyer. I did not call the Inspector General. I did not tell a soul. I waited, because my grandfather had taught me that patience is not passive. Patience is the loaded weapon you keep in the drawer while the fool across the table is still waving his around. During those 2 weeks, I watched. I attended a Sunday dinner at my parents' house in McLean, and I sat in my usual chair and I listened. Kyle was there, with Megan, his wife, who wore a new tennis bracelet and talked about their kitchen renovation. My father asked Kyle about his latest fund, and Kyle talked for 20 minutes about returns, about growth, about the new investors he had brought in from a group in Northern Virginia. My father listened, the way a man listens to a symphony, eyes half closed, nodding, savoring every note. My mother asked if anyone wanted more potatoes. I excused myself to use the bathroom, and on my way back, I passed my father's study. The door was open. On his desk, I saw a quarterly statement from Kyle's fund, Barrington Capital Partners. It was sitting in the open, face up, like it had nothing to hide. I did not touch it. I did not need to. I had already seen enough statements like it to know what was wrong. The returns were too consistent. Exposed to the sectors Kyle claimed, the returns should have shown volatility during the period when energy stocks corrected in the fall. They did not. They showed a smooth upward curve, the kind of curve that does not exist in nature. The kind of curve that exists in spreadsheets when someone is building the numbers backward from the conclusion they want. I went back to the table. I ate my mother's apple pie. I told Kyle it was good to see him. I was not lying. It was good to see him. Every time I saw him, I learned something new. The third week, I made my first move. I called a woman named Diane Okafor. Diane was a former colleague who had left the bureau 2 years earlier to work as a compliance consultant. She was sharp, discreet, and she owed me nothing, which is exactly why I trusted her. People who owe you something have a reason to manage you. Diane would tell me the truth because the truth was all she had to offer. We met for coffee at a place on Wilson Boulevard, a small shop with bad lighting and excellent espresso. I did not show her the document. I described a hypothetical: a family member running a fund, returns that seemed manufactured, possible commingling of investor funds with personal accounts, a pattern of new money coming in right before old obligations were due. Diane stirred her coffee and looked at me for a long time. She did not ask whose family member. She said, if this hypothetical were real, the person sitting on this information would have an obligation to report it. She said, if this hypothetical person happened to be a federal employee with access to financial intelligence databases and she failed to report what she knew, she would not just be complicit, she would be finished. She said all of this very quietly, looking at the table, and then she looked up at me and said, "You already know all of this. So the real question is, what is stopping you?" I told her I needed to be sure. She said that was reasonable. She also said that certainty is a luxury, and sometimes you have to act on the weight of evidence rather than waiting for the last piece to fall. She finished her coffee. She wrote a name on a napkin. Martin Achebe. He was an attorney in D.C. who specialized in whistleblower protections. She said, "Call him before you do anything else." She said it twice. I put the napkin in my coat pocket. I drove home. I sat in the parking lot of my apartment building for 11 minutes with the engine off, watching the wind move through the bare trees along the sidewalk. A woman walked past with a stroller, bundled against the February cold. Everything was ordinary. Everything was about to change. I could feel it, the way you feel a shift in pressure before a storm. Not in your ears, but somewhere behind your sternum. I went upstairs. I called Martin Achebe. He answered on the third ring. I told him my name and my position, and I said I had a situation that required careful handling. He said, "They all do." He said, "Come in Tuesday at 4. I said I would be there. I hung up. I locked the encrypted drive back in the safe. I made dinner, pasta with olive oil and garlic, and I ate it standing at the counter because I have never once used my dining table for dining. I washed the dish, I wiped the counter, and then I did something I had not done in a very long time. I called my mother. Not to tell her anything, just to hear her voice. She talked about her garden, about the frost that had killed her rosemary. She asked if I was eating enough. I said yes. She said she worried about me living alone. I said I was fine. She said, "You always say that." I said, "No." We hung up. I stood in my kitchen in the quiet. In 6 days, I would sit in Martin Achebe's office and set something in motion that could not be stopped. My father would call it betrayal. Kyle would call it jealousy. My mother would cry. None of them would call it what it was. It was my job. It had always been my job. They just never took it seriously enough to be afraid. 6 days later, I sat in Martin Achebe's office on the 4th floor of the Federal Building in downtown Richmond. The room smelled like old coffee and printer toner. There was a framed photograph of Martin shaking hands with the Attorney General on the wall behind his desk, slightly crooked, and I remember thinking that someone should straighten it. Strange, the things your mind reaches for when your hands are steady, but your chest is tight. Martin closed the door. He sat down across from me. He did not smile. He said, "Walk me through it." I opened the folder. Not the copy, the original. 47 pages of procurement records, email chains, and a signed affidavit from a subcontractor in Newport News named David Reese, who had grown tired of lying to auditors. I laid them out one by one on Martin's desk, like cards in a game I had been holding for months. He did not touch them at first. He just read with his eyes, leaning forward, his reading glasses low on his nose. The room was silent except for the ventilation system humming through the ceiling tiles. After 11 minutes, he looked up and said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Confirmed, 4 months. Suspected, closer to 2 years." He nodded slowly. Then he picked up the phone and called someone named Janet and said, "Clear my afternoon." That was a Tuesday. By Thursday, a grand jury had been convened. By the following Monday, Kyle's company, Harding Loss Defense Solutions, received a federal subpoena for all records related to Contract Series 9-7744, a naval maintenance contract worth $61 million over 5 years. The contract my father had helped Kyle win by making introductions at a retirement dinner in Norfolk 3 years earlier. The contract Kyle had padded with ghost invoices for parts that were never delivered to ships that were never serviced. I was not present when the agents arrived at Kyle's office in Virginia Beach. I learned later that he was eating lunch at his desk, a turkey club from the deli downstairs, and that when the 2 agents walked in and presented the subpoena, he laughed. Actually laughed. He told them there must be a mistake. He told them to call his attorney. He told them his father-in-law was a retired Navy captain and that this would be sorted out by dinner. It was not sorted out by dinner. My father called me that evening. I was in my apartment, sitting on the couch with a glass of water, not wine, because I wanted to be completely clear for whatever came next. His voice was the voice I had heard my entire life when he believed someone beneath him had stepped out of line. Controlled. Clipped. The voice he used on junior officers who disappointed him. He said, "Naomi, what have you done?" I said, "My job." He said, "Your brother-in-law is facing a federal investigation. Your sister is in pieces. Your mother cannot stop crying, and you sit there and say it is your job." I said, "It is my job, Dad. It has been my job for 9 years. You just never paid attention to what I actually do." He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "You could have come to me first. I would have handled it. I would have made him stop. We could have kept this in the family." I closed my eyes. I pressed my thumb against the scar on my left palm, the one from the fence I climbed when I was 12, trying to keep up with Kyle and Jessica on a dare. I said, "That is exactly the problem. You think everything can be kept in the family. You think your name is a roof that covers everything. It is not. $61 million in fraudulent billing is not a family matter. It is a federal crime." He hung up. He did not slam the phone. He simply stopped being on the line, which was worse. My sister Jessica called 20 minutes later. She was crying. She said, "He is going to lose everything, Naomi. The house, the cars, the kids' school. Do you understand what you have done to my children?" I said, "Kyle did this, Jess, not me. I found it. There is a difference." She said, "You found it and you chose to destroy us with it." I said nothing. There was nothing to say that she could hear right then. She was standing inside a burning building, and I was the one who had pulled the alarm, and she could not yet tell the difference between the fire and the siren. The formal indictment came 3 weeks later. United States versus Kyle Emerson Harding. 12 counts of procurement fraud. 4 counts of wire fraud. 2 counts of making false statements to federal investigators, because Kyle, in his infinite confidence, had lied during his first interview with the agents. He had looked 2 federal investigators in the eye and told them every invoice was legitimate, that David Reese was a disgruntled former partner, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. The agents had already seen the documents. They let him talk. They let him bury himself with his own voice. The arraignment was held in the federal courthouse on Broad Street. I attended. I sat in the 3rd row on the left side, closest to the window. The courtroom smelled like wood polish and wool. Kyle walked in wearing a charcoal suit I recognized from Thanksgiving 2 years before. He looked thinner. When he saw me, he stopped for half a second. His attorney touched his elbow and guided him forward. He did not speak to me. He did not need to. His face said everything. It said, "You were supposed to be irrelevant." The magistrate judge read the charges. Kyle stood with his hands clasped in front of him, very still, the way men stand when they are trying to project calm, but their body has already understood something their mind refuses. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty. Bail was set at $200,000. My father posted it that afternoon. After the hearing, I walked out through the lobby. The marble floor echoed under my shoes. My father was standing near the entrance, waiting for Kyle's attorney to finish a conversation. He saw me. We stood 15 feet apart. He looked old in a way I had not noticed before, or maybe had not allowed myself to notice. His jaw was set, but his eyes were tired. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather would be ashamed of you." I felt it land. I will not pretend I did not. Grandpa Earl's name in my father's mouth, used as a weapon, aimed at the center of me. My throat tightened. But I did not look away. I said, "No, he would not. And we both know that." My father's left hand trembled, just slightly. Then he turned and walked out into the gray afternoon, and I stood alone in that lobby listening to the echo of his shoes fade until there was nothing left but the sound of the building breathing around me. The federal investigation moved faster than any of us expected. Within 3 weeks of that hearing, Kyle was formally indicted on 11 counts: wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering. The numbers were specific and ugly. $2.4 million diverted from a defense contracting firm in Norfolk, where Kyle had been working as a senior financial analyst, funneling payments through shell companies he had registered in Delaware under variations of our family name. The FBI had been watching him for 14 months before they moved. 14 months. Which meant they had been building their case while my father was still toasting Kyle at Thanksgiving, still calling him the pride of the Hargrove family, still telling anyone who would listen that his son was the one who had made something real of himself. The trial date was set for September. Kyle's attorney negotiated, delayed, filed motions. None of it worked. The evidence was overwhelming. Digital records, bank statements, testimony from 2 former colleagues who had cooperated early. Kyle pleaded not guilty, which surprised no one and changed nothing. My father hired a private attorney for Kyle, cost him $90,000 out of his retirement savings. I know this because my mother called me one evening in late June, her voice thin and careful, and told me. She said, "Your father is emptying everything." She said, "I cannot stop him." She did not ask me to help, and I did not offer. But we stayed on the phone for 40 minutes saying almost nothing, and when she hung up, I sat in my kitchen in Fayetteville, listening to the cicadas outside the window and feeling something I could not name. Not satisfaction, something heavier and quieter than that. Kyle called me once. Early July. I almost did not answer. I saw his name on the screen and let it ring 4 times while I stood in my hallway with my hand on the phone. Then I picked up. He was crying. Not the dramatic kind, the exhausted kind, where the voice just cracks at the edges and the breathing goes ragged. He said, "Mara, I need you to understand I never meant for any of this." I said nothing. He said, "Dad is going to lose the house." I said, "I know." He said, "Can you help?" I said no. There was a long pause. Then he said, "You must be enjoying this." And I told him the truth, which was that I was not enjoying any of it, that there was no version of this where I felt good, that watching my family collapse was not the victory he imagined I wanted. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I am sorry about your ceremony, the one Dad missed." I did not expect that. I held the phone against my ear and closed my eyes and said, "Thank you." Then he said, "I have to go," and the line went dead. My father did not call. Not in July, not in August. My mother gave me updates in small pieces, like she was rationing them. "Your father is not sleeping. Your father went to the VA for his blood pressure. Your father sits on the porch and does not come in until midnight." I listened to each one and filed it somewhere deep and tried not to let it pull me under. In September, Kyle took a plea deal. His attorney finally convinced him. He pleaded guilty to 4 counts in exchange for the others being dropped. The sentencing hearing was in October. He received 42 months in a federal correctional facility in Petersburg. I was not in the courtroom for sentencing. I did not need to be. My mother texted me the result. Just the number. 42 months. No commentary. I read it sitting at my desk at work, and then I went back to reviewing a training schedule for incoming NCOs, and I did not think about it again until that night when I was driving home, and I had to pull over on Bragg Boulevard because my hands were shaking on the steering wheel and I could not see the road clearly. I did not cry for Kyle. I cried for the family that might have been. For the version of us where my father looked at both his children and saw them. For the Thanksgivings and the Christmases and the ordinary Tuesday phone calls that would never happen now. I sat in my car in a gas station parking lot with the engine running and the radio off, and I let it come through me like weather. And when it was done, I wiped my face and drove home and made dinner and fed my dog and went to bed. A week after sentencing, my Aunt Linda called. My father's older sister, the one who had always been quietly kind to me but never intervened. She said, "Mara, I want you to know something." She said, "Your father sat in my kitchen last night and he cried." She said, "He told me he wasted his pride on the wrong child." She said he did not say your name, but we both knew who he meant. I thanked her. She said one more thing. She said he will never tell you himself because he does not know how, but he knows. I said, "That is not enough, Aunt Linda." And she said, "I know, sweetheart. I know it is not." That was the closest I ever got to an apology from my father, delivered secondhand through a woman who loved us both and could fix neither of us. For a long time, I carried Grandpa Walt's phrase like a stone in my pocket. You do not need them to see you. You just need to see yourself clearly. When I was 19 and he said it to me in that garage with the smell of motor oil and old radio static, I thought he was telling me to be patient, to wait, that eventually my father would look up from Marcus and notice me standing there in my dress blues, in my commendations, in the quiet architecture of a life built on discipline rather than charm. I thought clearly meant eventually, obviously, undeniably. I thought if I just kept polishing myself into something bright enough, the light would reach even him. I was wrong about what the phrase meant for almost 20 years. It was not about patience. It was not about waiting to be discovered. It was about the possibility that the discovery would never come, and that this had to be survivable. More than survivable. It had to be ordinary. It had to be Tuesday. I understood this fully only in the weeks after Aunt Linda's call. I would be driving to work on Route 29, with the Shenandoah foothills green and soft in the morning mist, and I would think about my father, sitting in his sister's kitchen, weeping over a son in federal prison. And I would feel something that was not anger, and not satisfaction, and not grief. It was more like recognition. Like seeing a photograph of a house you lived in as a child and realizing it was always smaller than you remembered. He wasted his pride on the wrong child. That was what he told Linda. And even in that sentence, even in what was apparently his most vulnerable moment, he could not say my name. He could not say, Mara, I was wrong. He said it in the passive voice, as if pride were a resource that had been misallocated by some invisible bureaucracy, as if he bore no more responsibility for it than a man bears for the weather. I want to be honest here. There is a version of me, maybe a younger version, who would have taken that second-hand confession and run with it. Who would have driven to his house and stood in his doorway and said, "Say it to me, say it to my face, say my name and tell me you were wrong." Who would have needed the scene, the closure, the camera-ready reconciliation? But I have spent 22 years in federal law enforcement. I have sat across from men who trafficked human beings and listened to them explain why they were the real victims. I know what a confession sounds like when it is designed to relieve the confessor rather than repair the damage. And I know that some doors, once you stop trying to open them, reveal themselves to have been walls the entire time. So I did not drive to his house. I did not call. I did not write a letter or send a message through Linda or show up at Thanksgiving to force a reckoning. I let it sit. I let him sit. And I examined myself instead. Because here is the part that no one tells you about vindication. It does not feel the way you imagined. When I was 26 and Marcus was getting his second car from Dad while I was paying off student loans in a studio apartment with a window that faced a brick wall, I used to fantasize about a moment exactly like this. The truth revealed, the favorite son exposed, the father weeping. And in that fantasy, I always felt triumphant, clean, released. In reality, I felt tired. Not disappointed, not bitter, just tired. The way you feel after a long hike when you reach the summit and the view is exactly what the photograph promised, but your knees hurt and your water bottle is empty and you think, okay, now I have to walk back down. I also had to be honest about my own part in the machinery. Not in Marcus's crimes, no, but in the family silence. There were moments, many of them, when I could have spoken more directly, when I could have said, "Dad, this is wrong," when I could have refused to attend dinners where Marcus held court, when I could have drawn a line in public instead of retreating into competence as a substitute for confrontation. I chose a strategy of proving through performance. It was the only strategy I knew, the one Grandpa Walt's phrase seemed to endorse. But there is a shadow side to see yourself clearly, and it is this. Sometimes seeing yourself clearly means admitting that your silence was not always strength. Sometimes it was just fear wearing a uniform. I do not say this to excuse my father. What he did, the choosing, the discarding, the decades of casual cruelty dressed up as preference, that was his. He owned it, even if he could never say so. But I was not a passive object in a display case. I was a person who made choices too, and some of those choices kept me locked in a room I had the key to leave much earlier than I did. Grandpa Walt died believing I would be fine. He was right. But I think if he had lived longer, he might have amended his phrase. He might have said, "You do not need them to see you, Mara, but you are allowed to need people." Not him, not that specific approval, but people, warmth, the ordinary grace of being known without having to present your credentials first. I started seeing a therapist that spring, a woman named Dr. Halloran in an office in Fairfax with a white noise machine outside the door and a single framed print of the Outer Banks on her wall. I told her everything. She did not gasp or cry or tell me I was brave. She asked me questions I had never thought to ask myself, like, what would you have wanted from your father if Marcus had never existed? And I sat there for almost 2 full minutes in silence, because I realized I had never separated the wanting from the competition. I had never imagined a world where I was not the alternative to someone else. That was the real work. Harder than any federal case I had built. No evidence room, no chain of custody. Just me in a chair with a box of tissues I refused to touch. Learning to say things out loud that I had only ever said in the running monologue of my own head. I still go to that office every other Thursday. I probably will for a long time. There is no graduation ceremony for this kind of thing. No certificate you frame and hang next to your degrees. You just keep showing up, and the silence between the hard questions gets a little shorter. And one day you realize you answered something honestly, without needing to rehearse it first. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when I drove out to the Outer Banks. Not because of the print on Dr. Ellison's wall, though I'd be lying if I said it hadn't planted the seed. I just needed to be somewhere with a horizon line and no cell service. I rented a cottage in Rodanthe, the kind with peeling blue paint and a screen door that didn't latch properly. I brought a bag of groceries, 2 books I never opened, and my grandfather's field compass, the one he carried through Korea and gave me when I turned 12. The brass is so worn now that the engraving is just a ghost of letters. But the needle still finds north. It always finds north. I sat on the porch that first evening with a glass of wine I barely drank and watched the sun go down over the Pamlico Sound. The water was flat and silver, and the sky did that thing it does out there, turning colors that don't have names, colors that exist for maybe 4 minutes and then are gone forever. A pelican flew low over the water and folded itself into a dive so clean it barely made a splash. I thought about my grandfather saying that to me in the garage on Maple Street, his hands black with motor oil, his voice quiet and sure. You do not have to be loud to be right, Noelle. You just have to be steady. I used to think he meant patience. Wait long enough and the truth comes out. But sitting on that porch, with the salt air pulling at my hair, I understood he meant something else entirely. He meant that steadiness is not about endurance. It is about alignment. You find what is true, and you orient yourself toward it, and you stop apologizing for the direction you are facing, even when everyone around you is pointing somewhere else and insisting you are lost. My father called on Thanksgiving. I was at Claire's apartment in Arlington. She had burned the rolls and we were laughing about it when my phone buzzed on the counter. I looked at the screen and Claire looked at me and neither of us said anything. I let it ring. He left a voicemail. I listened to it 3 days later, standing in the parking lot of the Quantico field office with my coffee going cold. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. He said he wanted to see me. He said he had been thinking. He did not say he was sorry, but he said the word wrong twice, as in, I think some things went wrong, and for him, that was seismic. I saved the voicemail. I have not called back yet. I am not sure when I will. Dr. Ellison says there is no deadline for that kind of decision, and I believe her, though the part of me that spent 30 years trying to earn a seat at his table still flinches at the waiting. Marcus took a plea deal in February. 3 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of conspiracy. His attorney negotiated it down from the full indictment, which would have included money laundering and tax evasion charges that carried a combined maximum of 40 years. He got 6 years at a federal facility in Cumberland, Maryland. I know this because it was public record, not because anyone in my family told me. My mother sent me a text that said, "Please pray for your brother," and I did not respond, because I did not know how to say that I had been praying for him for years, just not in the way she meant. I do not celebrate what happened to Marcus. I want to be clear about that. There is a version of this story where I stand on the rubble of his life and feel vindicated, but that is not my story. He is my brother. He is a man who was handed so much approval so early that he never learned the weight of earning something. And when the earned things didn't come, he built counterfeits. I understand that now, in a way I couldn't before the therapy, before the Outer Banks, before I let myself stop being his mirror and started being my own person. The thing I carry with me, the thing that matters, is not the courtroom or the plea deal or the look on my father's face when the agents walked in. It is the sound of the screen door in Rodanthe not quite closing, and the wind coming through the gap, and the way I sat there in the almost dark and felt, for the first time in as long as I could remember, that I was not waiting for anyone to tell me I was enough. I was just enough. Quietly. The way a compass needle is enough. It does not argue with magnetic north. It does not explain itself. It just points true and lets you decide whether to follow. If you are listening to this, and you are the one in your family who keeps showing up and keeps being overlooked, I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it in the voice of a woman who spent 3 decades earning the right to say it. You are not invisible. You are just standing so still that the people spinning around you have mistaken your steadiness for absence. But you are there. You have always been there. And one day the spinning stops, and what is left standing is what was real all along. You do not have to be loud to be right. You just have to be steady.